Ultralearning by Scott H. Young, full book summary. What if you could learn anything faster and more efficiently than you ever thought possible? Whether you want to master a new language, become a programming wizard, or dive deep into personal development, Ultralearning by Scott H. Young gives you a blueprint to do exactly that. This book unlocks the secrets to supercharging your learning ability and mastering complex skills in record time. Chapter 1. What is Ultralearning? Imagine a world where you could learn anything you wanted, whether it's mastering a new language, becoming proficient in a complex skill like coding, or even delving deep into a specialized subject like neuroscience, in record time. What if I told you that there's a way to bypass the traditional methods of learning and still achieve mastery at an accelerated pace? This is the central promise of Ultralearning by Scott H. Young, and it's the idea that Scott opens with learning, but not just any learning, ultralearning. Now, Scott isn't just talking about some casual hobby learning here. This is about learning with an intensity and focus that allows you to take on big challenges and conquer them efficiently. He introduces Ultralearning as a strategy of aggressive, self-directed learning that helps people master hard skills in a surprisingly short time. But why should we care about this concept? Well, think about how fast the world is changing. The skills you learn in a traditional classroom may not be enough to keep up with the demands of the future. Scott argues that Ultralearning provides a way to stay ahead, a way to thrive in a world where knowledge and skills are constantly evolving. He doesn't downplay the difficulty. Ultralearning is not easy. But the payoff? It's huge. Imagine being able to learn anything quicker and more effectively than others. That's the promise Ultralearning holds, and Scott wants to show us exactly how to do it. In this opening chapter, Scott shares stories of historical and modern-day ultralearners. One of the most famous is Benjamin Franklin, who, despite having no formal education, taught himself everything from philosophy to science, becoming one of the most accomplished men in history. Then there's Judit Polgar, a Hungarian chess grandmaster, who became one of the greatest players in the world through relentless, focused learning from a young age. Scott highlights how both these figures, and others like them, used self-directed, intense learning to achieve mastery. It's not about having a natural gift, it's about having the right approach. So, what makes Ultralearning different from traditional education? Scott emphasizes that while formal education gives you structure and guidance, it often lacks intensity and flexibility. Traditional schooling moves at a slower pace, catering to a group rather than individuals. Ultralearning, on the other hand, is fast, flexible, and tailor-made to your needs. It's designed to be difficult because, according to Scott, real learning often happens when we push ourselves beyond our comfort zones. If you've ever felt like learning in a classroom was too slow or inefficient, Ultralearning might be the answer. But Scott doesn't just leave us with the theory. He's practical. He assures us that Ultralearning can be done by anyone, regardless of age or background. It's about mindset and strategy. And to help us get started, he sets the stage by introducing 9 key principles that underpin the Ultralearning method. These principles, he tells us, are the tools that will guide us through any learning project, no matter how big or small. In essence, the first chapter serves as both a promise and a challenge. Scott is inviting us to step into a new way of learning, one that might be uncomfortable at first, but will ultimately lead to extraordinary results. It's about becoming a deliberate, self-directed learner in a world that values speed and expertise. As we move into the next chapters, Scott will break down exactly how to apply this Ultralearning framework to any skill or knowledge area we wish to master. Chapter 2. Why Ultralearning Matters. As we move into the second chapter, Scott builds on the foundation he laid in the first. The question at the heart of this chapter is, why does Ultralearning matter so much? It's easy to dismiss the idea of aggressive learning as something only a few people need, but Scott quickly dispels this notion by explaining how crucial learning is in today's world. We live in a time where the skills you have today might be obsolete tomorrow. Think about it. Technology is advancing at a pace that's almost impossible to keep up with. New tools, new systems, and new ways of doing things emerge faster than ever before. The ability to learn quickly and adapt to new circumstances isn't just a nice-to-have skill anymore. It's essential for survival in the modern workforce. Scott uses a simple but effective example. Take the case of programming or software development. Just a few years ago, certain programming languages were in high demand. But today, if you're not constantly updating your skills and learning the latest tools, you could find yourself left behind. The same applies to other fields: medicine, finance, marketing, even creative industries. The landscape is constantly shifting, and if you can't learn quickly, you're at a disadvantage. But Scott doesn't stop there. He points out that ultralearning isn't just for career advancement. It's also about personal fulfillment. Many of us have hobbies or passions we'd love to pursue, whether it's playing an instrument, learning a new language, or mastering a craft. Yet we often feel like we don't have enough time, or we give up when progress feels slow. Scott argues that ultralearning offers a way to fast-track your progress, so you can achieve the things you've always wanted to without spending years on them. In this chapter, Scott also delves into the psychology behind learning. He explains that the traditional learning model, which many of us grew up with, is flawed. It's too slow, too rigid, and doesn't cater to the way we naturally absorb information. Ultralearning, by contrast, is designed to mimic the way the brain actually works. It taps into how we process and retain information, making it a more efficient way to learn. Another critical point Scott makes is that learning isn't just about acquiring new information. It's about building skills. In fact, Scott draws a clear line between knowledge and skill. Knowledge is something you can memorize and repeat, like facts or data. Skill, on the other hand, requires practice and application. Ultralearning focuses on building skills, not just accumulating knowledge. Whether you're learning to code, speak a new language, or play the piano, the goal is to become proficient and able to perform, not just understand in theory. At this point, you might be thinking, this sounds great, but is it really possible for everyone? Scott answers this question with a resounding yes. He emphasizes that ultralearning is not just for geniuses or people with exceptional talent. It's a strategy anyone can use. The key is to adopt the right mindset and commit to the process. You don't need a special background or years of experience in a particular field to succeed at ultralearning. What you do need is the willingness to push yourself beyond what feels comfortable and familiar. By the end of this chapter, Scott has made a compelling case for why ultralearning is not only relevant, but necessary in today's world. Whether you're looking to get ahead in your career, pursue a personal interest, or simply stay sharp in an ever-changing world, ultralearning provides a path forward. And it's a path that anyone can take, as long as they're willing to put in the work. Chapter 3. The 9 Principles of Ultralearning. Now that Scott has set the stage for why ultralearning is so crucial in today's fast-paced, skill-driven world, he takes us into the heart of his framework. In this chapter, Scott introduces the 9 key principles that form the foundation of the ultralearning process. These principles are not random or theoretical. They are drawn from extensive research, historical examples, and his personal experience with learning difficult subjects rapidly. Each principle plays a unique role in helping you master new skills efficiently and effectively. Imagine you're setting out on a journey to climb a mountain. You wouldn't start without the right gear, a map, and a plan to reach the summit. These principles are your ultralearning gear. They will help you navigate the path, stay focused, and make the most of your learning time. Scott presents these principles as a guide to tackle any subject or skill with confidence. But before we dive into the details of each principle, Scott emphasizes one important point. Ultralearning is not easy. It requires effort, commitment, and a willingness to push yourself beyond your comfort zone. This isn't a shortcut to learning. Rather, it's a way to optimize your efforts and make the time you spend learning more productive. If you're expecting instant results with minimal work, ultralearning isn't for you. But if you're ready to commit and follow the principles, the rewards can be life-changing. The first principle Scott introduces is meta-learning. This principle serves as the foundation of ultralearning and is the first step before diving into any learning project. Meta-learning is the process of learning how to learn. Think of it as a map you create before starting your journey. Just like you wouldn't venture into a forest without a map, You shouldn't start learning without first understanding the best approach for the subject you're tackling. Scott explains that every subject or skill has its own learning landscape. Some require more focus on memorization, while others might need hands-on practice or problem solving. By doing a bit of research up front, you can figure out the most effective ways to learn your chosen skill. For example, if you're learning a new language, you might focus on immersion and conversation practice. If you're learning to code, you might prioritize solving problems and writing code from day one. But meta-learning isn't just about understanding the subject itself. It's also about understanding how you learn best. Some people are visual learners, while others learn better by listening or doing. By recognizing your strengths and weaknesses as a learner, you can tailor your approach to suit your learning style. This makes the entire process more efficient. Scott also emphasizes that meta-learning involves setting clear goals. What do you want to achieve by the end of your learning project? Are you aiming for proficiency, fluency, or mastery? Knowing your destination will help you plan your learning journey and avoid wasting time on unnecessary detours. With the groundwork of meta-learning laid out, Scott moves on to the next principle: focus. In today's world, focus is becoming a rare commodity. We're constantly bombarded by distractions: our phones, social media, emails, and more. But to achieve the kind of deep, meaningful learning that ultralearning demands, you need to cultivate intense focus. Scott explains that focus isn't just about removing distractions, though that's certainly part of it. It's also about learning how to sustain concentration for long periods. Deep work, as Scott calls it, requires uninterrupted time, where you can dive fully into your learning without distractions. Whether you're learning a language, studying a new subject, or practicing a skill, the ability to focus deeply is critical to making progress. But here's the catch. Most people don't realize how unfocused they are until they try to concentrate for an extended period. Have you ever tried to study or work for an hour straight, only to find yourself checking your phone or browsing the internet within minutes? Scott offers practical advice on how to train your focus, starting with time blocking, the Pomodoro technique, and creating an environment conducive to concentration. He encourages you to start with short bursts of focused work and gradually increase the time as your ability to concentrate improves. The next principle Scott introduces is directness. This principle is all about learning by doing. Traditional education often emphasizes theory over practice. You spend hours reading textbooks or listening to lectures, but when it's time to apply what you've learned, you find yourself struggling. Scott argues that the most effective way to learn is to engage directly with the skill or subject you're trying to master. For example, if you want to learn how to speak a new language, don't spend months studying grammar rules and vocabulary lists. Instead, dive into conversations as soon as possible. Speak with native speakers, make mistakes, and learn in real time. The faster you can apply what you're learning, the quicker you'll make progress. This principle applies to any skill, from coding to music to public speaking. The key is to immerse yourself in real-world practice and get hands-on experience as early as possible. Moving on, Scott introduces the concept of drill. This principle is about breaking down complex skills into smaller, more manageable components, and then focusing on the weakest areas. When we're learning something new, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information or tasks involved. Drilling allows you to focus on one piece at a time, refining it until it becomes second nature. Scott uses an analogy to explain this principle. Imagine you're learning to play the piano. Instead of trying to master an entire song right away, you might focus on practicing just the left-hand chords or a particularly tricky passage. By isolating the hardest parts and drilling them repeatedly, you can improve your overall performance faster than if you tried to practice everything at once. Drilling is especially important when you hit a plateau in your learning. It's easy to get stuck at a certain level and feel like you're not making progress. But by identifying your weaknesses and drilling them with focused practice, you can push through these plateaus and continue improving. Next, we arrive at the principle of retrieval. Scott explains that one of the most powerful ways to learn is through active recall. Instead of passively reviewing information, like rereading notes or watching a video, retrieval involves actively trying to remember what you've learned. This process strengthens your memory and helps you retain information for the long term. Think of it like this. Your brain is like a muscle, and the more you exercise it through retrieval, the stronger your memory becomes. Scott offers several techniques for incorporating retrieval into your learning, including self-testing, flashcards, and spaced repetition. The key is to challenge yourself to recall information without looking at your notes, forcing your brain to work harder and, in turn, solidifying your learning. Another crucial principle is feedback. Scott explains that feedback is the lifeblood of ultralearning. Without it, you have no way of knowing whether you're improving or making mistakes. But not all feedback is created equal. In fact, too much positive feedback can be harmful if it prevents you from addressing your weaknesses. Scott breaks down feedback into 3 types: outcome feedback, which tells you the results of your performance; informational feedback, which provides details on where you went wrong; and corrective feedback, which offers guidance on how to improve. The best kind of feedback for ultralearners is immediate, specific, and actionable. Whether you're practicing a musical instrument, learning a language, or improving your writing, timely feedback will accelerate your progress by showing you what to fix and how to do it better. We now move to retention, a principle that addresses one of the most common learning problems: forgetting what you've learned. Scott explains that most people assume forgetting is inevitable, but with the right techniques, you can dramatically improve your retention. He introduces the concept of spaced repetition, a method where you review information at gradually increasing intervals to ensure it stays fresh in your memory. Retention isn't just about memorization, though. Scott emphasizes the importance of understanding over rote memorization. If you truly understand a concept, you're less likely to forget it. He encourages learners to focus on building a deep understanding of their subject rather than simply cramming information that will quickly fade from memory. The next principle, intuition, might seem a little abstract at first, but it's a critical component of mastery. Intuition is the ability to grasp complex concepts effortlessly, to see patterns and connections that others might miss. This kind of understanding doesn't come from superficial learning. It comes from immersion and experience. Scott explains that intuition is developed by spending time with the subject, grappling with its complexities, and looking for underlying patterns. Whether you're learning to code, solve math problems, or write poetry, developing intuition requires you to move beyond surface-level knowledge and engage with the deeper structure of the subject. This process takes time and practice, but once you've built intuition, you can approach problems and challenges with greater ease and confidence. Finally, Scott introduces the principle of experimentation. Learning isn't a one-size-fits-all process, and experimentation encourages you to try new methods, challenge assumptions, and find what works best for you. Scott emphasizes the importance of tinkering, trying different approaches, failing, adjusting, and trying again. He shares stories of ultralearners who broke from conventional methods and experimented with their learning process. By testing new strategies and embracing failure as part of the learning journey, you can discover more effective ways to learn and grow. The willingness to experiment also fosters creativity and innovation in your approach to learning. Chapter 4. Meta-learning. Learning how to learn. Now that Scott has introduced the 9 principles, we're ready to dive deep into each one, starting with meta-learning. This might be the most important principle because it's about learning how to learn. Think of it as the foundation of your ultra-learning project, the blueprint that will guide you through the entire journey. Meta-learning, Scott explains, is the first step before you begin any serious learning endeavor. If you want to learn faster and more effectively, you need to understand not just the material you're learning, but how to approach learning that material. Imagine you're about to set out on a long road trip. You wouldn't just hop into the car and start driving without a map, right? Meta-learning is that map. It helps you plan your route so you don't waste time going in the wrong direction. But what exactly does meta-learning involve? Scott breaks it down into 3 key components: knowing the what, the why, and the how of your learning project. First, let's talk about the what. This refers to understanding the subject you're trying to learn. Before you dive into textbooks, tutorials, or practice sessions, you need to take a step back and figure out what the key concepts, facts, and skills are within that subject. You don't want to waste time learning things that aren't crucial to your goals. For example, if you're learning a new language, it's more important to focus on everyday conversational phrases than on obscure grammatical rules you might rarely use. Similarly, if you're learning to code, you'll want to start with hands-on practice rather than diving too deep into computer science theory. The next part of meta-learning is understanding why you're learning. Motivation plays a huge role in how effectively we learn. Scott encourages you to get clear on your reasons for pursuing this ultra-learning project. Are you learning for a career change? To develop a new hobby? To challenge yourself intellectually? Knowing your why will not only help you stay motivated when the learning gets tough, but it will also guide your decisions about what to focus on. If your goal is to learn French so you can travel in France, your learning strategy will be very different from someone who's studying French to read classic literature. Finally, there's the how of meta-learning. This is where you map out the most effective learning methods for your subject. Scott explains that different subjects require different approaches. If you're learning to play the piano, for instance, you'll need to spend a lot of time practicing scales and pieces on the actual instrument. But if you're studying history, you might spend more time reading, writing summaries, or discussing ideas with others. Understanding the nature of the subject and how people typically learn it will help you craft a better learning plan. One of the ways Scott suggests doing this is by conducting a bit of research before you start learning. He recommends looking at how experts or teachers in the field approach the subject. What resources do they use? What techniques do they emphasize? You can even talk to people who have already mastered the skill you're trying to learn and ask them for advice on the best ways to go about it. This research will give you a head start and prevent you from making common mistakes. But Scott doesn't just stop at understanding the subject itself. He also encourages you to think about your own personal learning style. Some people are visual learners, others learn better through auditory methods, and still others prefer hands-on learning. Figuring out how you learn best is a crucial part of meta-learning. Once you understand your strengths and weaknesses as a learner, you can adapt your approach to suit your natural preferences. This makes the learning process more enjoyable and effective. Another critical part of meta-learning is identifying the key obstacles that might slow down your progress. Every subject has its difficult parts, and Scott advises that you should be prepared for these in advance. For example, if you know that grammar is particularly challenging for you when learning a new language, you can plan to spend extra time on that area or find specific exercises that target it. This foresight will help you avoid frustration later on when you hit those inevitable roadblocks. One of Scott's most important messages in this chapter is that meta-learning is not a passive activity. It's something you actively plan and refine throughout your learning journey. In fact, as you start learning, you'll often realize that some of your initial assumptions were wrong. That's okay. Meta-learning is about constantly adjusting your strategy as you gain new insights into both the subject and yourself. It's a dynamic process, not a one-time thing. By the end of this chapter, Scott has equipped us with a powerful tool, the ability to plan and approach any learning project with precision and purpose. Meta-learning is the compass that ensures you're always heading in the right direction, saving you time and energy as you move forward. But, as Scott points out, knowing how to learn is only the beginning. The next step is developing the discipline to stay focused, which is where the principle of focus comes in. Chapter 5. Focus. Learning without distractions. With meta-learning as your foundation, the next challenge in the ultra-learning process is learning how to focus. In today's world, this is easier said than done. We live in a time when distractions are everywhere, whether it's your phone buzzing with notifications, emails piling up, or the temptation to scroll through social media. And yet, focus is one of the most important elements of effective learning. Without the ability to concentrate deeply, you can't absorb information or practice skills at a high level. Scott opens this chapter by addressing the most common misconception about focus, that it's just about avoiding distractions. While eliminating distractions is certainly part of the equation, true focus goes much deeper than that. It's about training your brain to sustain attention on a task for extended periods, and to do so with intensity. Many of us think we're good at multitasking, responding to messages while studying, jumping between tabs while working, and checking social media during breaks. But as Scott explains, multitasking is one of the worst habits for learning. Research shows that when you try to juggle multiple tasks at once, your brain has to constantly switch back and forth between them. This not only slows you down, but also weakens your ability to retain information. In fact, Scott argues that multitasking is the enemy of ultralearning. So how do you cultivate true focus in an age of constant distraction? Scott shares several strategies that ultralearners use to master their concentration. One of the most effective techniques is time blocking. The idea is simple. You schedule specific blocks of time during which you will focus exclusively on your learning project. During these blocks, you eliminate all distractions and commit to working on one thing and one thing only. This could be 30 minutes, an hour, or even longer, depending on your ability to sustain focus. Scott encourages starting with shorter blocks of time if you're new to this method. The goal is to gradually increase your ability to concentrate for longer periods. Just like a muscle, focus can be strengthened with practice. Over time, as you get used to deep work, you'll find that your ability to stay focused improves. But what happens when your mind wanders? This is a common problem, especially in the early stages of a learning project. You might sit down to study or practice, only to find your thoughts drifting to unrelated topics. Scott explains that this is normal, and it doesn't mean you're bad at focusing. The key is to gently bring your attention back to the task at hand, without getting frustrated. The more you practice redirecting your focus, the easier it becomes. Another strategy Scott shares is the Pomodoro technique. This involves working in short, intense bursts, typically 25 minutes long, followed by a 5-minute break. After 4 Pomodoros, you take a longer break. This method is particularly useful if you find it hard to concentrate for long periods. The Pomodoro technique creates a sense of urgency, as you know the timer is counting down, and the short breaks help to keep your energy levels up. Over time, you can extend the length of your work sessions as your focus improves. Scott also emphasizes the importance of creating an environment that's conducive to focus. This means removing any potential distractions before you start your learning session. Turn off your phone or put it in another room. Close unnecessary browser tabs, and let others know that you're not to be disturbed during your focus time. The fewer temptations there are, the easier it is to stay on track. But even with the best environment and time blocking techniques, maintaining focus can be mentally exhausting. Scott acknowledges that learning at an ultra-learning level requires intense mental effort, and that this effort can be draining. To combat this, he suggests incorporating active rest into your learning schedule. Active rest doesn't mean taking a nap or watching TV. It's about doing something mentally refreshing, but still engaging, like going for a walk, stretching, or even doing light physical exercise. These activities help clear your mind and recharge your focus for the next session. Scott also touches on the concept of mental energy. Just like physical energy, your ability to focus is a limited resource. You can't expect to sustain deep concentration for hours on end without taking breaks or managing your energy levels. By being mindful of how much mental energy you have and using strategies like time blocking and active rest, you can maximize your focus and avoid burnout. Chapter 6. Directness. Learn by doing. With a strong foundation in meta-learning and the ability to maintain focus, Scott takes us to the next principle, directness. This is one of the most powerful principles in the ultralearning process because it's rooted in the idea that the most effective way to learn is by doing. The central message of this chapter is simple but transformative. Don't learn about something. Do it. Scott begins this chapter by challenging a common learning habit that many of us have fallen into: spending too much time on abstract learning without ever actually applying what we've learned. Think about it. How often do we prepare to learn by reading textbooks, watching videos, or taking notes? But when it comes to actually using that knowledge in the real world, we fall short. Scott argues that this passive learning approach, while comfortable, is incredibly inefficient. The real learning happens when we apply our knowledge directly to the tasks we want to master. The principle of directness revolves around real-world application. If you're learning to code, the best way to get better isn't by watching tutorials endlessly. It's by writing actual code. If you're learning a new language, you'll make faster progress by engaging in real conversations rather than just memorizing vocabulary. The idea is to immerse yourself in the real situations where the skills you're learning are actually used. Scott provides several compelling examples of how directness can dramatically accelerate learning. One story he shares is about Benny Lewis, a renowned polyglot who speaks several languages fluently. Benny's approach to language learning is a perfect illustration of directness. Instead of spending months learning grammar and vocabulary before trying to speak, he jumps straight into conversation from day one. He makes mistakes, struggles to understand, and feels uncomfortable. But that's exactly the point. By immersing himself in real conversations, he forces his brain to adapt quickly, and as a result, he learns much faster than someone who spends months studying before speaking. The concept of learning by doing is not new, but Scott emphasizes how underused it is. Traditional education systems often separate theory from practice, and many of us have been conditioned to believe that we need to learn the theory before we can start applying it. Scott challenges this notion head-on, arguing that the best way to learn is to dive into practice as soon as possible. The theory can follow later, filling in the gaps as needed. But why does directness work so well? Scott explains that it taps into the way our brains are wired to learn. When we're directly engaged in a task, we're forced to problem solve, adapt, and make decisions in real time. This creates stronger neural connections, allowing us to retain and recall information more effectively. In contrast, passive learning, like reading or watching videos, often doesn't engage the brain deeply enough to result in long-term learning. It feels like you're learning, but without applying the knowledge, much of it fades away. Another key point Scott makes in this chapter is that directness creates immediate feedback, which is crucial for learning. When you engage in the real-world practice of a skill, you get instant feedback on what's working and what's not. This feedback helps you adjust your approach and improve faster. For instance, if you're learning to code and write a program that doesn't work, the error messages or bugs give you direct feedback on what you need to fix. This feedback loop allows you to make rapid progress. Scott acknowledges that learning by doing can be intimidating, especially when you're a beginner. The idea of jumping into a conversation in a new language or tackling a complex project when you're just starting out can feel overwhelming. But he argues that the discomfort is part of the process. In fact, discomfort is a sign that you're learning. When you challenge yourself to apply what you've learned in real situations, you're pushing beyond the limits of your current abilities, and that's where growth happens. To make this principle more actionable, Scott introduces the idea of project-based learning. Instead of thinking of learning as an abstract process, think of it as a series of real-world projects that help you build your skills. For example, if you're learning web development, instead of just studying HTML and CSS, take on a project to build a website. As you work through the project, you'll encounter challenges and problems that force you to apply what you've learned, ask new questions, and seek out the information you need to solve them. The project becomes both the practice and the learning. One of the key benefits of project-based learning is that it keeps you motivated. Abstract learning can often feel pointless because you're not seeing the immediate results of your efforts. But when you're working on a project, you have a clear goal and tangible outcomes. You can see your progress, which keeps you engaged and excited about learning. Scott also emphasizes that directness doesn't mean skipping over theory entirely. In fact, theory can be an important part of learning, but it should come as a supplement to practice, not as a replacement for it. He uses the example of learning to play chess. While studying chess strategies and watching games can help, the best way to improve is to play as much as possible. The theory becomes more useful when you're actively playing, as you can immediately apply what you've learned and see how it impacts your game. In this chapter, Scott also introduces a powerful technique known as immersive learning. Immersive learning involves surrounding yourself with the environment or context in which the skill is used, allowing you to absorb the knowledge and skills more naturally. For instance, if you're learning a language, You might immerse yourself by spending time in a country where that language is spoken. If you can't travel, you could create an immersive experience at home by consuming media in that language, engaging in conversations, and even thinking in that language as much as possible. Immersive learning forces you to use the skill in real situations, which helps you internalize it more quickly. Scott highlights the story of Emily, a woman who wanted to learn Mandarin Chinese. Instead of following the traditional path of language classes and textbooks, she moved to China and immersed herself in the language. Within months, she was able to speak fluently, far surpassing the progress of her peers who had taken the slower, more traditional approach. One of the biggest barriers to directness is fear of failure. Many people avoid learning by doing because they're afraid of making mistakes or looking foolish. Scott addresses this fear head-on, reminding us that mistakes are a crucial part of the learning process. In fact, making mistakes and correcting them is one of the most effective ways to learn. The sooner you embrace failure as a natural and necessary part of learning, the faster you'll improve. Scott encourages us to adopt a mindset of experimentation and curiosity, rather than perfection. By the end of this chapter, Scott has made it clear that directness is the fastest and most effective way to learn. Instead of wasting time on passive learning methods that don't engage your brain fully, you should immerse yourself in real-world practice, tackle projects, and apply what you're learning as soon as possible. This principle isn't just about learning faster, it's about learning better, with deeper understanding and stronger retention. Chapter 7. Drill: Mastering the Tough Spots. After diving into directness and understanding the importance of learning by doing, Scott introduces the next ultra-learning principle: drill. This principle takes a more focused approach to learning by helping you target and strengthen your weak areas. Scott argues that ultra-learners don't just practice mindlessly, they drill with purpose. This chapter is about breaking down complex skills into their smaller components and drilling those pieces until they become second nature. At the heart of the drill principle is a simple but powerful idea. Most of the skills you want to learn are made up of smaller, more manageable sub-skills. The problem is that when we practice a skill, we often try to tackle everything at once. We practice broadly, hoping that by repeating the same thing over and over, we'll improve in all areas. But Scott explains that this kind of practice is inefficient. Instead of practicing everything at once, you should isolate your weaknesses and drill those specifically. Imagine you're learning to play the guitar. Instead of practicing entire songs over and over, you would focus on the specific sections that are giving you the most trouble, perhaps a difficult chord progression or a tricky riff. By isolating and drilling the tough spots, you can make much faster progress than if you simply played the whole song repeatedly. Scott explains that this process of deconstruction, breaking a skill down into its component parts, is crucial for effective drilling. Deconstruction allows you to identify exactly what you need to work on. The idea is to figure out what part of the skill is holding you back, then create exercises or drills to target that specific area. By doing this, you focus your time and energy where it matters most, and the improvements you make will have a much bigger impact on your overall performance. One of the great things about drilling is that it helps you overcome plateaus. Have you ever felt like you're stuck at a certain level, no matter how much you practice? Plateaus are common in the learning process, but drilling can help you push through them. When you reach a plateau, it's often because you've reached the limit of what broad practice can achieve. To get better, you need to drill down into the finer details of the skill and focus on improving the parts that are holding you back. Scott uses the example of learning a language to illustrate this. When you first start learning a language, it's easy to make quick progress because everything is new. You're picking up basic vocabulary and grammar, and your skills are improving rapidly. But as you advance, you might hit a plateau where it feels like you're no longer improving as quickly. This is where drilling comes in. Instead of continuing to practice general conversation, you might focus specifically on the areas where you struggle, maybe pronunciation, listening comprehension, or verb conjugation. By drilling these specific areas, you can break through the plateau and continue making progress. Another key point Scott makes is that not all parts of a skill are equally important. Some parts of a skill are foundational, and if you master them, they can have a huge impact on your overall ability. For example, in public speaking, being able to organize your thoughts clearly is more important than memorizing your speech word for word. If you can master the foundational elements, the rest of the skill will come together more easily. Drilling allows you to focus on these key areas and improve them quickly. To make drilling more practical, Scott offers several techniques that ultralearners use to deconstruct and drill skills effectively. One of the most powerful techniques is time slicing, which involves dividing a complex skill into smaller time chunks. For example, if you're practicing a sport like basketball, instead of playing a full game, you might spend 10 minutes practicing your free throws, then 10 minutes on dribbling, then another 10 minutes on shooting from different angles. By time slicing, you're giving focused attention to each part of the game, ensuring that you improve in every area. Another technique is microscaling, which takes time slicing even further. Microscaling involves breaking a skill down into even smaller components and focusing on the most granular details. Scott gives the example of learning to play a musical instrument. If you're struggling with a specific chord transition on the guitar, instead of practicing the whole song or even the whole section, you might spend your entire practice session just working on the transition between two chords. By focusing on this tiny aspect of the skill, you can make rapid improvements that will have a significant impact on your overall performance. Scott also discusses the concept of copycat drills, which involve mimicking the performance of an expert. If you're learning to write, for example, you might choose a passage from one of your favorite authors and try to replicate their style. If you're learning to play chess, you might study and replicate the moves of a grandmaster. By copying the techniques of experts, you can learn to perform at a higher level and internalize the nuances of the skill. Drilling isn't just about practicing the parts of a skill where you're weak. It's also about refining your strengths. Scott explains that once you've mastered the basics, you can use drills to optimize your performance. For example, if you're already a good public speaker, you might drill specific aspects of your delivery, such as timing, body language, or vocal variety. By drilling these advanced elements, you can take your performance to the next level and become even more polished. One of the challenges of drilling is that it can sometimes feel repetitive or tedious. To keep things interesting, Scott recommends varying your drills and experimenting with different approaches. For example, if you're learning a language, you could mix up your drills by practicing with different conversation partners, listening to different types of audio content, or engaging in activities like reading or writing. The key is to stay engaged and motivated while targeting the areas that need improvement. Scott also acknowledges that drilling can be mentally exhausting, especially when you're working on something difficult. To prevent burnout, he suggests alternating between intense drilling sessions and more relaxed practice sessions. This way you can maintain your focus and avoid getting frustrated or overwhelmed. By the end of this chapter, Scott has shown us that drilling is an essential part of ultralearning. It's not enough to practice broadly. You need to drill with precision and purpose. Whether you're working on a foundational skill or refining an advanced technique, drilling allows you to target your efforts and make rapid improvements. This principle, when combined with the others, gives you the tools to push past plateaus and reach new levels of mastery. Chapter 8. Retrieval: Strengthening Your Memory. After focusing on drilling to target specific weaknesses and improve your skills, Scott introduces us to a principle that tackles one of the most essential aspects of learning: retrieval. This chapter dives into how we can strengthen our memory and retain the information we've learned for longer periods. Scott explains that most people are stuck in passive learning methods, rereading notes, reviewing lectures, or watching tutorials over and over again. These methods give the illusion of learning, but they don't actually help us retain information in the long term. The secret to real learning is active retrieval, forcing yourself to recall information from memory without looking at your notes or other resources. Scott begins by explaining why retrieval is so powerful. When you actively try to remember something, you're not just testing your memory. You're actually strengthening the neural connections in your brain that help you store and retrieve information. It's like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Each time you attempt to recall information, Even if you make mistakes, you're solidifying that information in your brain. This makes retrieval far more effective than passive learning methods like rereading or reviewing. The process of retrieval works because it forces you to engage deeply with the material. When you try to remember something, your brain has to work harder, and that effort helps consolidate the information into long-term memory. Scott argues that retrieval practice should be a central part of any learning strategy, regardless of the subject. Whether you're trying to learn a new language, study for an exam, or master a technical skill, retrieval will help you retain what you've learned much more effectively. One of the most common ways to practice retrieval is through self-testing. Scott explains that testing yourself regularly, not just before exams or evaluations, can significantly boost your retention. But self-testing doesn't have to be a formal or structured process. It can be as simple as closing your book or turning away from your notes and trying to recall key concepts, definitions, or ideas from memory. The act of recalling forces you to engage with the material in a deeper way. Scott encourages readers to think of learning as a cycle: study, test, correct, and test again. This continuous loop of learning and retrieval is far more effective than cramming information or passively reviewing material. When you realize that retrieval is difficult, it's a good sign. The harder it is to recall something, the more effort your brain has to make, and the stronger that memory will become. Struggle in retrieval is a sign that you're learning deeply. But Scott doesn't stop there. He also introduces a more advanced retrieval technique known as spaced repetition. This method involves reviewing information at gradually increasing intervals, based on the idea that reviewing material too soon after learning it can create a false sense of confidence. If you review too early, the information is still fresh in your mind, and it feels easy to recall. But when you wait a bit longer, just long enough that the memory begins to fade, you're forcing your brain to work harder to retrieve it, and that effort strengthens the memory. Spaced repetition works best when you use it strategically. Scott recommends spacing out your reviews in a way that allows enough time for forgetting to begin, but not so much that you completely forget what you've learned. For example, you might review information one day after learning it, then 3 days later, then a week later, then 2 weeks, and so on. This schedule ensures that you're reinforcing the memory at just the right intervals to keep it fresh in your mind without overwhelming yourself with constant reviews. Scott shares a fascinating study in the chapter that demonstrates the power of spaced repetition. In one experiment, participants were divided into 2 groups. One group was asked to study material all at once and then take a test immediately afterward. The other group studied the same material, but reviewed it at spaced intervals before being tested. The group that used spaced repetition performed significantly better on the test and retained the information for much longer. This experiment shows that learning isn't just about how much time you spend studying, but about how you space out your reviews and engage in active retrieval. But retrieval practice doesn't just apply to factual information. Scott emphasizes that retrieval is just as important for skills-based learning. Whether you're learning to play a musical instrument, solve complex math problems, or write code, you need to engage in regular retrieval to cement your knowledge and improve your performance. For example, a pianist might practice scales or chords from memory without relying on sheet music to strengthen their recall of musical theory and technique. A programmer might write code from scratch without looking at reference materials to ensure they truly understand how to implement solutions. One of the common misconceptions about retrieval is that it's just about memorizing facts. But Scott argues that retrieval isn't about rote memorization, it's about deep understanding. When you test yourself on material, you're not just trying to recall isolated pieces of information. You're also engaging with the broader concepts and seeing how they connect. Retrieval helps you build a mental framework that allows you to see the relationships between different ideas, which is crucial for mastering any subject. Scott introduces the idea of elaborative retrieval, a technique that involves not just recalling information but also explaining it in your own words or making connections to other things you know. For example, if you're studying history, instead of just recalling dates and events, you might try to explain why those events happened or how they relate to modern issues. This process of elaboration strengthens your understanding and makes the information more meaningful, which in turn makes it easier to remember. Another key aspect of retrieval that Scott discusses is the importance of variety in your retrieval practice. If you always test yourself in the same way, using the same types of questions or the same format, your brain becomes accustomed to that specific method, and the benefits of retrieval start to diminish. To keep your brain engaged and to improve retention, you should mix up your retrieval methods. For example, if you're studying for an exam, you might test yourself using multiple-choice questions one day, and then switch to open-ended questions or essays the next. By varying the way you test yourself, you're forcing your brain to engage with the material in new ways, which leads to deeper learning. Scott also addresses a common problem many learners face: overconfidence. When we review material passively, by rereading notes or watching a video, we often get the impression that we understand the material better than we actually do. This is known as the illusion of competence. The problem with passive review is that it's easy and gives us a false sense of mastery. We recognize the material when we see it, but that doesn't mean we can recall it when we need to. Retrieval practice helps break this illusion by forcing us to confront what we actually know and what we need to work on. One of the most powerful tools Scott introduces in this chapter is flashcards. While flashcards are often associated with memorizing vocabulary or definitions, Scott argues that they can be used for almost any subject. Flashcards force you to engage in active recall, and when combined with spaced repetition, they become a highly effective tool for retaining information. Whether you're learning a new language, studying for a test, or mastering a new skill, flashcards can help you practice retrieval in a focused and structured way. In fact, many ultralearners use software like Anki, a spaced repetition system, SRS, that automates the process of scheduling reviews at optimal intervals. Anki allows you to create digital flashcards and automatically adjusts the review schedule based on how well you recall each card. If you remember a card easily, Anki will delay the next review. If you struggle with a card, Anki will prompt you to review it sooner. This system takes the guesswork out of spaced repetition and ensures that you're reviewing material at just the right intervals. As the chapter wraps up, Scott reiterates the importance of making retrieval a regular part of your learning routine. Whether you're studying for a test, learning a new skill, or working on a personal project, regular retrieval will help you retain what you've learned and apply it effectively. Retrieval is one of the most powerful tools for strengthening your memory, deepening your understanding, and accelerating your learning. By incorporating retrieval into your ultra-learning project, you'll see faster progress and longer-lasting results. Chapter 9: Feedback: Learning from Mistakes. With the principle of retrieval under your belt, you now know how to strengthen your memory and deepen your understanding of any subject. But how do you know if you're on the right track? How can you ensure that your efforts are leading to real progress? That's where the next ultra-learning principle comes in: feedback. Feedback is one of the most powerful tools for improving your learning, and Scott dedicates this entire chapter to exploring its significance. Feedback provides you with the information you need to adjust your approach, correct mistakes, and refine your skills. The challenge, however, is getting the right kind of feedback at the right time. Scott opens the chapter by explaining that feedback is essential because it helps you see your blind spots. When you're learning something new, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you're doing better than you actually are. This is often due to a lack of awareness of where you're making mistakes. Without feedback, you might keep repeating the same errors, unaware that they're holding you back. He shares a vivid example from his own ultra-learning project. When he was learning to speak a new language, he realized that it was incredibly easy to think he was improving simply by practicing conversations with himself or passively listening to others. But when he engaged with native speakers and asked for feedback on his pronunciation and grammar, he quickly learned that he had been making some fundamental mistakes. These mistakes weren't obvious to him because he hadn't been getting the right kind of feedback. There are different kinds of feedback, and Scott breaks them down into three main categories: outcome feedback, informational feedback, and corrective feedback. Outcome feedback is the simplest type of feedback. It tells you whether or not you've succeeded. For example, if you take a test and get a score, that score is a form of outcome feedback. It tells you whether you passed or failed, but it doesn't give you any information about why you got the results you did. While outcome feedback can be useful, it's often not enough on its own because it doesn't give you the insights you need to improve. Next, Scott introduces informational feedback. This type of feedback goes beyond just telling you the result. It gives you specific information about what you did right and what you did wrong. For example, if you're learning to play a musical instrument and your teacher points out that your timing was off during a specific section of the song, that's informational feedback. It tells you exactly what part of your performance needs improvement. Finally, there's corrective feedback. This is the most detailed and actionable type of feedback because it not only tells you what you did wrong, but also gives you advice on how to fix it. For example, if your teacher not only points out that your timing is off, but also suggests practicing with a metronome to improve your rhythm, that's corrective feedback. It provides a clear path for improvement. Scott emphasizes that all three types of feedback are valuable, but corrective feedback is the most useful when you're trying to improve quickly. The more specific and actionable the feedback, the faster you'll be able to correct your mistakes and make progress. He encourages learners to seek out corrective feedback whenever possible, especially in the early stages of learning when you're more likely to make fundamental errors. One of the key points Scott makes in this chapter is that feedback needs to be immediate to be effective. The longer the gap between your performance and the feedback you receive, the less useful that feedback becomes. This is because your memory of the performance fades over time, making it harder to connect the feedback to the specific actions that caused the mistakes. Scott gives the example of a tennis player who practices their serve for hours but doesn't get feedback until days later. By that point, they may have forgotten exactly what they were doing during practice, making the feedback less relevant. To avoid this, Scott advises ultralearners to build feedback loops into their practice sessions. A feedback loop is a system that allows you to get immediate feedback while you're practicing. For example, a pianist might record themselves playing a piece and listen back to identify mistakes. A writer might ask for feedback from an editor after each draft. The idea is to create a constant stream of feedback that helps you adjust your approach in real time. Another powerful insight from this chapter is that not all feedback is helpful. Scott explains that some types of feedback can actually hinder your progress if they're not specific or accurate. For instance, vague feedback like "good job" or "that needs work" doesn't provide enough information to help you improve. Similarly, feedback that focuses too much on minor details can distract you from the bigger picture. To make sure you're getting useful feedback, Scott suggests seeking out experts or mentors who can give you high-quality, specific feedback. These people have a deeper understanding of the skill you're trying to learn and can provide insights that others might miss. For example, if you're learning to write, a professional editor can offer much more detailed and helpful feedback than a friend who isn't familiar with writing techniques. Scott also highlights the importance of being open to negative feedback. Many people shy away from criticism because it can be uncomfortable. But Scott argues that negative feedback is often the most valuable. It's the only way to truly understand where you need to improve. The key is to see negative feedback not as a personal attack, but as an opportunity to grow. By embracing feedback, even when it's harsh, you give yourself the best chance to learn and improve quickly. One particularly interesting concept Scott introduces is the idea of deliberate discomfort. This is the practice of intentionally putting yourself in situations where you're likely to receive tough feedback. While it might feel uncomfortable at first, this deliberate discomfort forces you to confront your weaknesses and make rapid improvements. For example, if you're learning public speaking, you might sign up for speaking engagements that are outside of your comfort zone, knowing that you'll receive honest feedback from the audience or your peers. This kind of feedback helps you improve much faster than staying within your comfort zone. Scott also acknowledges that feedback can sometimes be overwhelming, especially when you're getting a lot of it at once. To avoid feeling discouraged, he suggests focusing on one or two key pieces of feedback at a time. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, identify the most important area for improvement and work on that first. Once you've made progress in that area, you can move on to the next piece of feedback. In addition to receiving feedback from others, Scott encourages learners to engage in self-feedback. This involves critically evaluating your own performance and identifying areas for improvement. For example, after completing a project or task, you might ask yourself, what went well? What could have been better? What specific actions can I take to improve next time? By developing the habit of self-feedback, you become more self-aware and better equipped to make adjustments on your own. By the end of the chapter, Scott has made it clear that feedback is essential for growth, but it needs to be timely, specific, and actionable to be effective. He encourages ultra-learners to seek out feedback constantly and to embrace it, even when it's uncomfortable. With the right feedback, you can accelerate your learning and make significant progress in a short amount of time. Chapter 10. Retention. Keeping what you learn. Having mastered the principle of feedback, the next step in your ultra-learning journey is ensuring that the knowledge and skills you've gained stay with you for the long term. In this chapter, Scott tackles one of the most frustrating problems many learners face: forgetting. You've likely experienced this yourself, spending hours studying or practicing a skill, only to find that much of what you've learned slips away over time. This is where the principle of retention comes into play. Scott explains that retention is about making sure the knowledge you acquire sticks, and he provides strategies to help you avoid the dreaded forgetting curve. Scott begins by introducing the idea of the forgetting curve, a concept developed by German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus in the 19th century. The forgetting curve shows how quickly we lose information if we don't actively work to retain it. According to Ebbinghaus's research, most of what we learn is forgotten within a few days, unless we take steps to reinforce it. This is a natural part of how the brain works. Our minds are designed to prioritize information that is used frequently and discard information that seems less relevant. While this system is efficient in some ways, it's problematic when we're trying to retain new knowledge or skills. Scott explains that the good news is that the forgetting curve can be countered through deliberate strategies that strengthen retention. One of the most effective techniques is spaced repetition, which Scott touched on in the previous chapter about retrieval. Spaced repetition involves reviewing material at gradually increasing intervals after you first learn it. The idea is to re-engage with the material just before you forget it, which helps solidify it in your long-term memory. To illustrate the power of spaced repetition, Scott shares the story of how he applied this technique to his ultra-learning project of learning MIT's computer science curriculum in just 1 year. Faced with the massive amount of material to memorize, complex algorithms, mathematical formulas, and programming concepts, Scott knew that simple review sessions wouldn't be enough. Instead, he used a system of spaced repetition to schedule his reviews at optimal intervals, ensuring that the most important concepts stayed fresh in his mind over the long term. One tool Scott recommends for spaced repetition is Anki, a popular spaced repetition software that uses digital flashcards to help you practice retrieval at the right intervals. Anki adjusts the timing of your reviews based on how well you remember the material, giving you more frequent reviews for information you struggle with, and less frequent reviews for information you already know well. By automating the process of spaced repetition, tools like Anki make it easier to maintain a consistent review schedule without overwhelming yourself with too much at once. But spaced repetition isn't the only tool in the retention toolbox. Scott introduces another strategy called interleaving, which involves mixing up the types of material you study during a practice session. For example, if you're learning math, instead of practicing the same type of problem over and over again, you might switch between different types of problems in one session: algebra, geometry, calculus, forcing your brain to engage with the material in a more dynamic way. Research has shown that interleaving is more effective for retention than blocked practice, where you focus on one type of problem or skill for an extended period. Why does interleaving work so well? Scott explains that it's because interleaving makes your brain work harder. When you switch between different types of problems or material, your brain has to constantly re-engage with what you've learned, preventing you from falling into a pattern of passive repetition. This increased effort strengthens your understanding and helps the information stick better. Another crucial aspect of retention is understanding the material deeply. Scott points out that rote memorization, while useful in some cases, is far less effective than truly understanding the underlying concepts. When you understand why something works the way it does, you're much more likely to remember it. Scott offers the example of learning mathematics. Students who simply memorize formulas often struggle to apply them in unfamiliar situations, whereas students who understand the logic behind the formulas can use them flexibly across different problems. Scott introduces a technique called elaborative interrogation, which involves asking yourself questions about the material as you learn it. Instead of just passively absorbing information, you actively engage with it by asking questions like, "Why is this true?" Or, "How does this connect to what I already know?" This process forces your brain to make connections between new information and your existing knowledge, which improves both your understanding and your retention. Scott also emphasizes the importance of self-explanation, another powerful retention technique. When you explain a concept to yourself in your own words, you're not just reviewing the material, you're actively processing it and making it your own. This technique can be particularly useful when you're studying complex subjects like science or philosophy, where the material is abstract and difficult to grasp at first. By explaining the material to yourself or to someone else, you're essentially teaching it, which is one of the most effective ways to deepen your understanding and strengthen your memory. While spaced repetition, interleaving, and self-explanation are powerful tools, Scott also warns about the dangers of cramming. Cramming is the practice of trying to learn a large amount of material in a short period of time, usually right before an exam or deadline. While cramming can help you temporarily retain information for a test, Scott explains that it's a terrible strategy for long-term retention. The problem with cramming is that it overloads your short-term memory without giving your brain enough time to consolidate the information into long-term memory. As a result, most of what you crammed will be forgotten within days. Instead of cramming, Scott encourages learners to space out their study sessions over time. By giving your brain time to process and consolidate the material, you're more likely to remember it in the long run. This is why Scott emphasizes the importance of consistency in your learning habits. Small, regular study sessions are far more effective than infrequent, intense bursts of cramming. Scott also touches on the importance of sleep for retention. Sleep plays a critical role in memory consolidation, the process by which your brain solidifies the information you've learned during the day. Without enough sleep, your brain struggles to retain new information, no matter how hard you've studied. Scott shares research that shows that people who get enough sleep after learning new material perform better on memory tests than those who don't. This is why getting a good night's sleep is an essential part of any ultralearning project. Finally, Scott addresses the emotional side of retention. Many learners struggle with imposter syndrome, the feeling that they haven't truly mastered a skill or subject, even when they've put in significant effort. This feeling can lead to a lack of confidence and a fear of forgetting what you've learned. Scott encourages learners to recognize that forgetting is a natural part of the learning process and that it's okay to revisit material multiple times before it sticks. Instead of being frustrated by forgetting, he advises learners to embrace it as an opportunity to reinforce their knowledge through retrieval and spaced repetition. By the end of this chapter, Scott has equipped us with a variety of tools to improve retention. Whether you're using spaced repetition to review material at optimal intervals, interleaving to keep your brain engaged, or self-explanation to deepen your understanding, the key takeaway is that retention is an active process. It requires effort and strategy, but the payoff is long-term mastery of the skills and knowledge you're working so hard to acquire. Chapter 11. Intuition, Developing a Deep Understanding. Having established how to retain what you've learned over the long term, Scott now introduces the principle of intuition. This chapter is all about moving beyond surface-level knowledge and developing a deep, intuitive understanding of the material you're learning. Intuition, as Scott explains, is not something you're born with. It's something you can develop through deliberate practice and immersion. In this chapter, he shows how ultralearners build their intuition, allowing them to think creatively, solve problems more effectively, and apply their knowledge in new and unexpected ways. Scott begins by explaining that intuition is what separates novices from true experts. When you first start learning something, everything feels complicated and unfamiliar. You might rely heavily on memorization or follow rules rigidly because you don't fully understand the material. But as you continue learning, you begin to see patterns and connections that weren't obvious before. You start to internalize the material, and it begins to feel natural. This is intuition, an almost automatic understanding of how something works, which allows you to navigate complex problems with ease. To illustrate the concept of intuition, Scott shares the story of chess grandmasters. When chess players are just starting out, they often follow strict rules and strategies, relying on memory to remember opening moves or specific tactics. But as players advance, they develop a sense of the game that goes beyond memorized rules. They can look at a chessboard and intuitively know the best moves without thinking about the specific mechanics of each piece. This deep understanding allows them to play at a higher level and adapt to unexpected situations. Scott explains that intuition is developed by engaging deeply with the material and forcing yourself to confront complex problems. One of the key strategies for developing intuition is immersion. This means surrounding yourself with the subject you're learning, engaging with it in as many ways as possible, and immersing yourself in real-world challenges. For example, if you're learning a language, immersion might involve watching movies, reading books, and speaking with native speakers regularly. The goal is to expose yourself to the material in a way that forces your brain to internalize it. Scott introduces the concept of overlearning, which is a technique used to develop intuition by continuing to practice a skill even after you've achieved competence. For most people, once they reach a certain level of proficiency in a skill, they stop pushing themselves further. But ultralearners go beyond this point, engaging in overlearning to solidify their understanding. By practicing beyond what is necessary, they internalize the material more deeply, allowing them to apply it in new and creative ways. Overlearning isn't about repetition for the sake of repetition. It's about challenging yourself to engage with the material in increasingly difficult ways. For example, if you're learning to play the piano, instead of stopping once you can play a piece correctly, you might challenge yourself to play it faster, transpose it to a different key, or improvise around the melody. These kinds of challenges force you to think more deeply about the material, which helps build intuition. Another powerful technique for developing intuition is analogy making. Scott explains that one of the ways experts in any field build their intuition is by drawing analogies between different concepts. When you compare something new to something you already understand, you create mental shortcuts that make the material easier to grasp. For example, physicists often use analogies from everyday life to explain complex scientific concepts. By comparing the behavior of subatomic particles to something familiar, like the movement of water or sound waves, they can intuitively understand phenomena that are otherwise abstract. Scott suggests that learners actively look for patterns and analogies as they engage with new material. The more connections you can make between what you're learning and what you already know, the more intuitive the material becomes. This approach helps you move away from memorization and toward a deeper understanding of the underlying principles that govern the subject. One of the most important ideas Scott introduces in this chapter is that intuition isn't just about knowledge, it's about problem solving. Intuition allows you to approach problems with creativity and flexibility because you understand the material on a deeper level. Scott shares the story of Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was famous for his intuitive understanding of physics. Feynman didn't just memorize equations. He engaged with the material in a way that allowed him to visualize and deeply understand the problems he was solving. This intuitive grasp of the subject allowed him to come up with creative solutions to complex scientific problems. But Scott warns that developing intuition takes time and effort. It's not something that happens overnight. In fact, it often requires you to struggle with difficult problems and make mistakes. Scott explains that many learners are afraid of making mistakes because they see them as failures. But ultralearners embrace mistakes as opportunities to learn and improve. By confronting challenging problems head-on and working through them, you build the kind of deep understanding that leads to intuition. Scott introduces the idea of deliberate practice as a way to build intuition. Deliberate practice involves pushing yourself to operate at the edge of your abilities, constantly challenging yourself with tasks that are just beyond your current level. When you engage in deliberate practice, you're not just reinforcing what you already know, you're stretching your brain to understand the material at a deeper level. This kind of practice is uncomfortable, but it's essential for developing intuition. To make deliberate practice more actionable, Scott suggests breaking down complex problems into smaller challenges. Instead of trying to solve a large, overwhelming problem all at once, you can break it into smaller, more manageable pieces. For example, if you're learning to code, you might start by working on individual components of a larger project, like writing functions or solving specific algorithms. By tackling smaller problems, you can build your understanding gradually and develop the intuition to solve more complex challenges over time. Another powerful method for building intuition is teaching others. Scott explains that one of the best ways to solidify your understanding of a subject is to teach it to someone else. When you teach, you're forced to break the material down into simpler terms, which helps you process it more deeply. Teaching also reveals any gaps in your own understanding. If you can't explain something clearly to someone else, it's a sign that you don't fully understand it yourself. This process of explaining and simplifying forces you to think critically about the material, which helps build your intuition. Scott shares a story about Feynman's technique for learning, which became known as the Feynman technique. Feynman had a habit of taking a complex concept he wanted to understand and writing it down as if he were teaching it to someone else, using simple language and analogies. He would keep refining his explanation until it was so clear that even a beginner could understand it. If he got stuck, he knew that was a sign he needed to go back and study the material further. This technique is an incredibly effective way to develop both understanding and intuition, and Scott encourages learners to use it regularly. Scott emphasizes that repetition without understanding doesn't lead to intuition. Simply repeating the same actions over and over, without pushing yourself to think deeply about what you're doing, won't build the kind of intuitive grasp of a subject that ultra-learners aim for. Instead, you need to engage with the material on a deeper level, asking questions, exploring new angles, and looking for connections between concepts. He gives the example of language learning. A common mistake many language learners make is memorizing vocabulary words without context. While this can help in the short term, it doesn't build the kind of intuition that allows you to speak the language fluently. Instead, Scott advises learners to engage with the language in real conversations, where you're forced to use the vocabulary in context. This process of applying what you've learned in real-life situations builds a deeper understanding of how the language works, making it easier to recall words and phrases naturally. One of the most exciting aspects of developing intuition is that it allows you to think creatively. Once you have a deep understanding of a subject, you can begin to play with the ideas and combine them in new ways. Scott points out that many of the greatest breakthroughs in science, art, and business have come from people who developed a deep intuitive understanding of their field and were able to think outside the box. These individuals didn't just follow the rules. They understood the rules so well that they knew when and how to break them to create something new. As Scott moves toward the end of this chapter, he reminds readers that developing intuition is a long-term process. It requires patience and persistence. You won't become an expert overnight, and there will be moments of frustration along the way. But by continually engaging with the material, challenging yourself with complex problems, and applying what you've learned in real-world situations, you will gradually build the kind of deep, intuitive understanding that ultralearners rely on. Scott also highlights the importance of embracing ambiguity. When you're building intuition, there will be times when things don't make sense right away, and that's okay. It's part of the learning process. Instead of trying to force yourself to understand everything immediately, Scott encourages learners to be comfortable with the unknown and trust that clarity will come with time and practice. By engaging with difficult concepts, even when they seem confusing or overwhelming, you're laying the groundwork for deeper understanding. Finally, Scott offers some practical advice on how to incorporate intuition building into your ultra-learning projects. He suggests setting aside time for deliberate practice and immersion, and finding opportunities to apply what you've learned in real-world contexts. Whether it's through teaching others, solving challenging problems, or exploring analogies, the goal is to go beyond surface-level knowledge and push yourself toward deeper understanding. By the end of this chapter, Scott has made it clear that intuition is not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about developing a deep, almost instinctive understanding of the material. This kind of intuition allows you to think creatively, solve problems more effectively, and apply your skills in new and unexpected ways. While developing intuition takes time and effort, the rewards are immense. You'll not only learn faster, but you'll also be able to use what you've learned in more flexible and creative ways. Chapter 12. Experimentation. Push the boundaries of learning. After exploring how intuition helps deepen your understanding and mastery of a subject, Scott introduces the final principle of ultralearning: experimentation. This principle is about breaking free from the conventional methods of learning and embracing the mindset of curiosity and discovery. Scott explains that experimentation is what sets ultralearners apart from traditional learners. While most people stick to tried-and-true methods, ultralearners are constantly looking for new and innovative ways to push the boundaries of their learning. Scott begins this chapter by explaining that learning is inherently an experiment. Whether you realize it or not, every time you try something new, whether it's practicing a new skill, solving a problem, or applying knowledge in a different context, you're conducting a small experiment. You're testing your current understanding and abilities against the unknown, and through trial and error, you refine your approach. Experimentation, therefore, isn't just a tool for learning. It's at the heart of the learning process itself. Scott argues that one of the biggest obstacles to experimentation is fear of failure. Many learners are afraid to step outside their comfort zones because they worry about making mistakes or looking foolish. But Scott challenges this mindset, explaining that failure is an essential part of learning. In fact, the more willing you are to experiment and fail, the faster you'll improve. Every failure is a data point, providing you with valuable feedback about what works and what doesn't. Scott shares the story of Thomas Edison, one of the greatest inventors in history, to illustrate the power of experimentation. Edison's approach to invention was based on a relentless willingness to try new things, even if they failed. When developing the electric light bulb, Edison conducted thousands of experiments, trying different materials for the filament until he found one that worked. Instead of seeing each failed experiment as a setback, Edison viewed them as steps toward success. His famous quote, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work," captures the spirit of experimentation that Scott encourages all learners to adopt. One of the key insights Scott provides in this chapter is that experimentation allows you to challenge assumptions. Often we approach learning with certain assumptions about how things should work or how a skill should be practiced. But these assumptions can limit our progress. By experimenting with different methods, techniques, and approaches, we can uncover more effective ways of learning that we might not have considered. Scott encourages learners to question their assumptions and be open to new possibilities. For example, if you're learning a new language, you might assume that you need to follow a structured curriculum or learn grammar rules before you can start speaking. But ultralearners like Benny Lewis, who mastered multiple languages through immersion and conversation from day one, challenge this assumption. Benny experimented with speaking the language immediately, even though he didn't know all the rules. This approach allowed him to learn much faster by focusing on real-world communication instead of memorization. Scott emphasizes that experimentation doesn't have to be risky or extreme. You don't need to overhaul your entire learning strategy or take big risks to benefit from experimentation. Instead, Scott suggests starting with small experiments. These are low-stakes trials where you try something new and observe the results. For example, if you're learning to code, you might experiment with a different programming language or framework to see if it makes your learning more efficient. If you're learning a musical instrument, you might experiment with a new practice technique, such as slowing down difficult passages or improvising around a melody. These small experiments help you gather data about what works best for you. One of the most powerful tools for experimentation is iterative improvement. Scott explains that ultra-learners don't just experiment once and then stop. Instead, they continuously refine their methods through multiple iterations. Each time they try something new, they learn from the results and make adjustments. Over time, this process of iterative improvement leads to significant gains in both efficiency and effectiveness. Scott encourages learners to adopt a mindset of constant refinement. No matter how good your current method is, there's always room for improvement through experimentation. Scott introduces a useful framework for conducting experiments, which he calls the explore-exploit trade-off. This concept comes from the field of machine learning but applies equally well to human learning. The idea is that when you're learning something new, you have two competing goals: exploring new methods and approaches to find the best one, and exploiting the methods that already work well. The challenge is to strike a balance between the two. If you spend all your time exploring, you might never settle on an effective method, but if you spend all your time exploiting a single method, you might miss out on better, more efficient approaches. To navigate the explore-exploit trade-off, Scott suggests following a cycle of experimentation. When you're starting a new learning project, spend more time exploring different methods and techniques. Try a variety of approaches and see what works best for you. Once you've found a method that seems effective, shift your focus toward exploiting it, practicing it consistently, and building on it. But don't stop experimenting entirely. Periodically return to the exploration phase to test new ideas and see if you can improve further. This cycle of exploration and exploitation ensures that you're always refining your approach and making progress. Scott also discusses the role of play in experimentation. While learning can sometimes feel like serious work, Scott encourages learners to approach experimentation with a sense of curiosity and playfulness. When you view learning as an experiment, it becomes less about getting things right and more about discovering what's possible. This playful mindset makes learning more enjoyable and reduces the pressure to succeed, which in turn makes you more willing to take risks and try new things. To highlight the value of experimentation in creative fields, Scott shares the example of musicians and artists who use experimentation to push the boundaries of their craft. Many of the greatest artists in history, from Pablo Picasso to John Coltrane, were relentless experimenters. They didn't stick to one style or method. Instead, they constantly evolved by trying new techniques, exploring different genres, and combining elements from various disciplines. This willingness to experiment allowed them to innovate and create groundbreaking work that transformed their fields. Scott explains that the same principles apply to any field of learning, whether you're a scientist, entrepreneur, or student. Experimentation helps you break free from rigid patterns and find new ways to solve problems. It encourages creativity, innovation, and resilience. When you experiment, you become more adaptable, which is crucial in today's fast-changing world. You're no longer bound by traditional methods or expectations. You're free to chart your own path. Another important benefit of experimentation is that it helps you develop confidence in your ability to learn. When you see that you can try new things, make mistakes, and still make progress, you start to trust your own learning process. This confidence makes you more willing to take on challenges and explore areas outside your comfort zone. Scott emphasizes that this self-confidence is one of the key traits of ultra-learners. They're not afraid to experiment because they know that failure is just part of the journey. Toward the end of the chapter, Scott provides a series of practical tips for incorporating experimentation into your ultra-learning projects. 1. Start small. Begin with low-risk, low-stakes experiments. Test different techniques, tools, or approaches, and see what works best for you. These small experiments will give you valuable insights without overwhelming you. 2. Track your results. Keep a record of your experiments. What did you try? What worked? What didn't? This data will help you refine your approach over time and avoid repeating the same mistakes. 3. Embrace failure. View each failure as a learning opportunity. When an experiment doesn't go as planned, don't get discouraged. Instead, ask yourself what you can learn from the experience and how you can adjust your approach next time. 4. Seek feedback. Use feedback from others as part of your experimentation process. Get input from mentors, peers, or experts who can offer new perspectives and help you refine your methods. 5. Be playful. Approach experimentation with a sense of curiosity and fun. Don't take it too seriously. Learning should be an enjoyable process of discovery. 6. Iterate. Don't settle for your first success. Keep experimenting, refining, and improving your approach. Over time, these small adjustments will add up to significant gains in your learning. By the end of this chapter, Scott has shown us that experimentation is the key to unlocking your full learning potential. It allows you to test new ideas, challenge assumptions, and push the boundaries of what's possible. Whether you're learning a new skill, developing a creative project, or solving complex problems, experimentation helps you innovate and improve faster than traditional methods ever could. With experimentation, Scott concludes the final principle of ultralearning. But before wrapping up, he shares a powerful reminder. Ultralearning is not about following a rigid set of rules. It's about taking control of your own learning process and adapting it to fit your needs. The principles he has shared are tools, not commandments, and it's up to you to decide how to use them. The true power of ultralearning comes from your willingness to push yourself, experiment, and continuously improve.